Greetings and greetings. Possibly a shorter episode today, although I often say that and then I get going and it becomes longer than I thought. But I wanted to do a kind of demonstration, and I had an idea that will likely become a bit of a series. And that is, you may remember, Guess the Guru. That was a fun game from earlier in the history of the podcast. And I thought of another fun game that we could play called Structure Before Story, the blind chart. And the idea behind this is to demonstrate, well, first, definitely to have fun, exercise your mind, improve your astrological and pattern recognition prowess. But central to all of that is to demonstrate the difference between descriptive astrology and what I'm calling developmental astrology, which is the same difference. Funny phrase, same difference. It's the same difference. That was an expression my father used to say, same difference. An oxymoronic expression. The parallel issue is what it looks like when astrology operates at the level of form rather than expression, or structure rather than expression. I see structure as sort of an aspect of form, but depending on the definition, they're somewhat interchangeable. So, as happens in just about everything sophisticated, and certainly everything structural in our world, I mean, not everything, but most things, are diluted from strong structural, foundational, principled, those are all sort of synonymous, concepts, precepts, tenets. They get diluted and mainstreamified into expression, description, from context to content. And so one of the central, I don't know what the word is, I guess principles, one of the central drivers, algorithms. I'm doing a lot of synonymizing today. I guess I'm not happy with the first choice of my words. Pardon me. The governing dynamic of this discovery that I've made about Vedic astrology is exactly that. It was relegated and diluted to content, and the structural brilliance of it was lost. And it was the structural brilliance of it that was what Carl Jung was onto. My research says it was limited to sort of symbolic diagnosis, not actual structural mechanisms, which is understandable because things we take for granted today about the structure of the psyche and how it works were, cutting edge, if at all discovered then. There's a lot more sort of algorithms of the psyche that are more well-trodden territory now. So anyway, so I thought it would be fun to show what a read looks like by using a blind celebrity chart. Now, I don't mean a celebrity that's blind, although that could be interesting as well. I just mean I don't tell you who it is until the end. See, that's fun, right? So the idea is to show the structure and how the structure could be anyone. Well, not anyone. How the structure narrows the kinds of people it could be, and to get your mind turning around, okay, that's the structure. What are the possible kinds of expression that this structure could turn into? And who might this describe? And so I think it's a useful exercise, and this is really important, to discipline the mind and the individual to stay in the structural world. That's what I'm learning in this practice of developmental astrology, it's very easy to slip into expression level stuff. For example, and some of it is built into the Vedic astrology paradigm. Well, it depends on what you mean by that. Or so it seems. I don't think it has to be. But like, quick aside, I will not use, and I'm writing this in the book, we have to get rid of strong and weak, good and bad. Strong and weak maybe, depends on how you define it. But there is no good and bad placement in developmental astrology. That has to go. Because as soon as you label something good or bad, you're not in what I'm calling developmental astrology anymore. The descriptive astrologists out there, and you could be one of them, that's fine. You can do that. It's important to make a distinction, though. And that means an exalted planet is not good and a debilitated planet is not bad. Because as soon as you moralize it with that good and bad, you take it out of what it actually structurally is. It's a growth opportunity. It's a developmental tension. It's like calling, the weight over your head bad. But if you're using that weight to make yourself stronger, then it's not bad, is it? It's something you can work with to make yourself stronger. Well, so it is the case with how our psyche is structured, which is mapped astrologically. So that's a clean way of sort of summing it up, because there is so much victimhood, existential level victimhood in astrology. That's like, oh, I have a bad placement of this, and I'm in this bad period in Vedic astrology, referring to the dashas. I'm in the Saturn period, and that's bad and hard. It immediately dilutes the paradigm and distorts it with human victimhood. And the price of that is immense, because then the developmental tensions are teachers. They're opportunities. And if you ignore them, they don't go away, they get worse. So, yeah, that's my preamble on this. So I thought it would be fun as a way of exhibiting this. And I may do in this podcast is probably the only thing I'm going to talk about. That was a sort of extended introduction, and now I'll demonstrate it. But in future episodes, I'm planning on doing maybe a quicker one, because it won't require the preambles, and it will be part of whatever else I do. Okay, so are you ready? I'm tentatively calling this Structure Before Story, the Blind Chart. And now you're playing with me. Here we go. Okay, so structural elements of the chart. In the future, I may do the visual aid. Maybe I'll throw it in afterwards. I don't think it's necessary. If you want to play astrologer and write this down, you can do it. I'll make it really simple. This chart is Leo rising, Mars in first house, Jupiter in second house, Moon in Scorpio. It's a Jyeshta nakshatra, if you know that one. And that Moon in Scorpio is conjunct Ketu in the fourth house. Rahu is conjunct Sun in the 10th house. Conjunct, for those who are new, means they're in the same house. So we have Moon and Ketu in fourth in Scorpio, Rahu conjunct Sun in the 10th, Mercury in 11th, Saturn conjunct Venus in the 12th. Again, that's Saturn conjunct Venus in the 12th. So there's a lot of dyads. There's 3 different dyadic conjunctions in this chart. And the major period this person is, right now, real living person, is Jupiter. They're in a Jupiter major period. So again, the goal here is not to describe a personality in the ordinary sense, but to identify the architecture. We're looking for the primary functions, the domains in which they operate, the major tensions between them, and the likely pathways through which the individual stabilizes or destabilizes. High level. So we start with the rising sign. The ascendant, which is by definition of the first house is the interface with reality. So a Leo rising means the interface with reality is organized around centrality, visibility, and the establishment of a distinct center. And this is a developmental astrology definition of what the first house is about: interface with reality. So it's a Leo interface with reality. Centrality, it will get reduced with Leo to wanting to be the center of attention. But to be cleaner about it, again, descriptive versus structural, centrality, visibility, establishment of a distinct center. Does that mean that they're an arrogant Leo that needs to have all the attention? No, not necessarily. That would be a reduction of that. Okay. From a high-level structural point of view, it means that reality is not met diffusely or tentatively, but through the need to occupy a position from which action, significance, and authority can radiate outward. That can be healthy or unhealthy. It depends. So the first question for a system like this is not merely how to survive, but how to stand at the center of experience in a way that feels consequential. Leo rising wants impact. Okay, so this does not tell us whether the result is leadership or performance, self-importance, theatricality. It only tells us that the interface with reality is built around that centrality. That's Leo rising. So what happens when a person must meet reality through that centrality theme? What kinds of lives might that produce? Now, we're starting with someone who's a celebrity, so, we're not pulling some Joe Schmo off the street who's a Leo rising, because, of course, 1 out of 12 people are Leo rising, so they can't all be celebrities. That's like 8.5% or something. Not 8.5% of people are celebrities, so there is a bit of a bias there. It could produce visible leadership. It could produce someone who's a street performer and is totally unknown, but they still need to have that centrality. It could produce someone who cannot tolerate being the reference point because they're drawn to it, but it's confused, problematic, gets them into trouble. So they're very much against being the reference point. It can do different things. It depends. But there's going to be some issue around that centrality. But it can produce the opposite, the same way you see I've seen a chart of someone with 4 planets in the 10th house, which points toward public authority, and the person is practically allergic to responsibility. But there's all of this potential responsibility in that 10th house, but choices, conditioning, reaction, whatever, it can result in wanting to get away from it. So it can go either way, but it's going to be something about the theme. Right? Now, if this sounds vague, I can understand why, but it's like issues around centrality, you could say, are predictable with a Leo rising. It's not vague if you can think structurally, and that's part of the discipline here, to not reduce it to a description that you can hold on to, like, oh, there must be an arrogant Leo, right? Not necessarily. Oh, they want to be the center of attention all the time. Not necessarily. They may hate being the center of attention, but find themselves in that situation anyway, right? So you have to stay at a high level without going to a content conclusion, and you stay in context. Okay, I'll do less explanation as we go, as I do more of these in the future, but I want to put a lot of context around this in the beginning to explain how and why this works. Okay, so step 2, you're imagining a possible celebrity still. Now the plot thickens here. Mars is in the first house, adds force directly to the interface. Right? So the first house is the interface with reality. Mars is mobilization and application of force. Force is not secondary in a Mars first house placement. So it's part of the system, how the system first meets reality. An existential kind of application or potentiality of force, mobilization of force. It's more than potential. The person does not merely stand in a relational field or an existential field. They push into it. And that's going to add to the Leo thing. The interface is therefore not just central. Leo centralizes, but Mars makes it a force-bearing, a force-pushing type dynamic. At a structural level, this means the person is likely to address reality through initiative, confrontation, pressure, assertion, whether that becomes courage, possible descriptive outcome, content outcome, could be combativeness, could be decisiveness, could be impulsivity, depends on the rest of the chart and on their personal development and choices. The point here is that force is built into the point of contact at an existential level in the first house. So what happens when a person's first move is not to assess or harmonize or adapt, but a person like this, their first move is to assert? What kind of environment would refine that into leadership? What kind of choices would let it become domination? If you see a Leo rising with Mars in the first house, a sort of clue from another model, you would be reasonable to suspect the person is an Enneagram 8. That's a good example of how astrology is upstream of the Enneagram. However, there are other houses, right? But it would depend on, there could be other things in other houses that would turn them into a different Enneagram type, as we'll see here. But you'll see that the 8 stands. So that's a bit of a hint. But yeah, if you see Mars in Leo, there would have to be quite a set of yin stack on the other side of the yin-yang seesaw to stop that person from being an 8, because Mars in first house in Leo is quite assertive, right? Okay, so now let's look at the nodal axis. That's Rahu and Ketu. Looking at the nodal axis is a really great way to get to know a chart. From what I've looked at in Western astrology, it doesn't look like it's given nearly the attention that it deserves. In Vedic astrology, it tends to be reduced to like what's the bad, hard kind of stuff for the person rather than the developmental lesson. So in this chart, Rahu in the 10th with Sun and Ketu 6 houses away. They always are. Ketu in the 4th conjunct Moon. Interesting that they are, Rahu and Ketu are both conjunct. Rahu conjunct Sun, Ketu conjunct Moon. There's a kind of poetry in that, especially given that Rahu is the amplifier, distorter. It's the hungry ghost called sometimes. It creates insatiable hunger that fits with the outward energy of Sun, and Ketu is the removal, separation, dissolution energy, which very much fits with Moon. So there's an amplification going on there. So this is the central developmental tension in the chart. So the 10th house, as I mentioned earlier, is the domain of authority and responsibility, the domain in which one becomes accountable within a larger structure and visible in relation to consequence. Now, remember, this chart is someone who wants to be visible because of the Leo rising. So with Rahu in 10th, that adds on to that. Also, the 4th house, where Ketu and Moon are, is the domain of foundational grounding and base, what grounds the person beneath action and gives them an internal base of continuity, internal foundation, internal state, internal stability. That's the 4th house. So the axis, and you see this, is not uncommon, the 4-10 Ketu Rahu. It's kind of an archetypal thing, and you see it with a lot of strong personalities, celebrity people and leaders, etc. Development is pulled toward visible authority in this axis, toward public structure, toward outer consequence, while the domain of inner base, grounding, and internal restfulness is unstable, detached, or underdeveloped. So it's a map of a potential compensatory dynamic. Why deal with the inner instability when you can just push outward? That's the structural potentiality here. And with Rahu conjoining the Sun in the 10th, identity is drawn toward... wait, did I cover that already? Sorry. lost my place here. I'm going by a bit of an outline. No, I didn't say this already. With Rahu conjoining the sun in the 10th, identity is drawn outward. Sun, identity, is drawn outward toward authority, 10th house, recognition, and centrality in the public field. The self seeks to become real through visible consequence and role. With Ketu conjoining the moon in the 4th, the inner base is not the site of secure continuity. It's fragmented, detached, and difficult to inhabit steadily. That's the impact of Ketu, which detaches, fragments, inhibits stability, affecting the moon, which is our ability to emotionally regulate. Ketu conjunct moon is already a challenging combination because, like I said, whatever house it's in, moon is your ability to stabilize. It's your internal steadiness. And then the 4th house is the house of that internal steadiness. So when you put Ketu conjunct moon in the 4th, you've got a severe internal fragmentation, detachment, a severe, potentially, inner state of instability. So where inner grounding is weak, as you see often, if you have a Ketu in 4 and a Rahu in 10, if the 4th house is challenged, you can predict that there's going to be an outer compensatory role in the 10th house, even without the moon and the sun piece here. But the moon position in the 4th and the sun position in the 10th practically guarantees it. At least it says, boy, if this person doesn't do a lot of work to sort their inner world out, they're going to push, they're going to compensate through public centrality, pushing dominance, etc. And this is, see the manuscript that I released a little over 2 months ago. This is one of the markers of what identity would call a Geffian soul, someone who's using domination as a way to compensate for internal emotional difficulties. Not just for Enneagram 8s, but of course commonly so. So then what happens when a person must derive stability from the outer public field when the inner one doesn't hold? Ambition, high performance, dependence on visible authority, leadership. Another possibility would be the inability to separate selfhood, represented by sun, from the public authority role of the 10th house. And with Rahu there, amplifying and distorting that dynamic. We would just look on paper like, wow, that's a big challenge. That's a heavy weight. Now let's talk more about the moon in Scorpio in the 4th. So at the structural level, like I said, moon is regulation. The nakshatra, which that's the specific phase, the degree range of the moon in Vedic astrology, is where they derive a big chunk of the personality, which is really interesting because the moon is a regulation pattern. It's our ability to maintain and regulate an internal state. So just looking at the moon placement in terms of dominating personalities, it's really interesting because in Western astrology, this is sort of an aside, Western astrology uses the sun sign as a description of your personality. That's the content expression part. Whereas in Vedic astrology, they look at what's going on the inside of you, which of course has downstream effects, but they derive personality, broadly speaking, from how you process reality emotionally. And so Jayeshta, which is a Scorpio moon nakshatra that this celebrity has, as a regulation pattern, tends toward control, tends toward strategic superiority in the shadow of things, and maintenance of position under pressure. Scorpio places regulation in a field of intensity, loss of control, and destabilizing depth. Scorpio is intense. A Scorpio moon is intense It regulates via depth, and it can mean regulation via instability, which is sort of a paradox, but that's how it goes for Scorpio moons. The Scorpio moon is more interested in intensity than stability. So it's seeking to find stability through intensity, and that can go different ways, as some Scorpio moons will tell you. Because this is in the fourth house, like I said before, the regulation pattern is in the domain of foundational grounding, and K2 fragments and detaches what it touches. So, again, to summarize, the regulatory base of this chart is unstable, intense, and compelled toward control, but at the same time, compelled toward loss of control. It's sort of back and forth. So regulation is not achieved through openness, not through softness, not through harmony, not through consistency. It's attempted through maintaining position inside instability, but in the domain in which that regulation must occur is itself fractured. That's the K2 and 4. So this is not a description of emotional volatility in the usual sense. It's a structural statement. The base from which the person should ground themselves doesn't hold consistently. And the method of regulation is itself pressure-based rather than restful. This kind of placement doesn't regulate via rest. They regulate via intensity. This is the kind of thing that would cause people, for example, to be free climbers, or trauma surgeons. People who, in the face of intensity, it actually somehow paradoxically calms them instead of making them an anxious wreck. So what would they do with this? Do they seek power? Do they seek control? Do they seek visibility? Would this person seek all of that? Some of that? Do they try to regulate themselves through dominance, through strategy? Could be a military strategist. Could be, like I said before, an extreme sports person. But this is a kind of thrill seeker in a way. But what is the content of the thrill? That depends. Okay. So now we have the spine of the chart established. The interface, Leo in first, is central and force-bearing with Mars in first in Leo. The developmental pole is toward public authority. That's the 410 axis. The inner base is unstable. That's the fourth house. The regulatory system is intense and control-based with Moon in Scorpio in 4. So the core structural compensation is inner instability is managed through outer centrality and authority. That's the essential logic of the chart. That's the structure. Okay, now let's look at some of the supporting functions. Jupiter in the second house. So at the structural level, Jupiter is expansion toward integration and meaning. Expansion toward integration and meaning. People will reduce Jupiter to, goodness or harvest or what do they do with Jupiter? Wealth that gets associated with. Those are downstream effects. Jupiter is not necessarily good, and I refuse to call it a benefic planet. It's expansion toward integration and meaning. So that can mean expanding some things that are flawed in order to dead end them. That can be quite a mess. Or it can scale something that is healthy and scalable and will actually work, which then brings success. It could also bring success in something that isn't really you. So you realize how flawed your values are or how meaningless your life is. It can do that too. It just adds volume. It expands. And that's not necessarily good or bad. So this person has Jupiter in the second house, which is the domain of continuity and sustenance. Continuity and sustenance is the existential structure of the second house. It's the question of what must persist for continuity of being. So Jupiter here expands, justifies, or enlarges the structures through which continuity is maintained. It attempts to build a larger or more meaningful sense of what must persist in order for the self to continue. So this can express downstream as confidence in one's value, because values are associated with the second house. It could be an enlargement of what one considers one's resources, right? So because second house is about continuity and sustenance, downstream of that is money. Downstream of that is self-worth. So it can also have to do with food, because food is associated with sustenance. So this Jupiter in second house could cause someone to have issues with food, or issues with money, or issues with self-worth, or all of those things. It could expand that in healthy ways or unhealthy ways. It's going to be expansive. It can also be an expansive use of speech in support of continuity, because speech is downstream of continuity and sustenance. We use words to persist, to interact with the world and people. It's a way we express our continuity and persistence. That's why people will often reduce the second house to money, speech, and there's a third one I forget, but it's bigger than that. It's continuity and sustenance. Okay, so structurally, the point is very simple. Jupiter, the function that expands and integrates meaning, is applied to the domain of sustenance and continuity. So, what happens when a person expands their own continuity structures? Generosity of scope, inflation around what must be preserved, using meaning itself to justify the enlargement of self-sustaining structures. Could be any of those things, right? We're staying at a high level. Those are just examples. Okay. All right. We're almost done. We're over the halfway point here. So now, hang with me. Mercury in 11th house. Mercury is differentiation and processing of information. The 11th house is the domain of systems and collective organization, the larger field of networks, alliances, collective patterns, distributed structures beyond the personal center. So Mercury here processes information in relation to collective systems. Information in relationship to collective systems. So it's going to differentiate, organize, and track patterns in a wider social or systemic field. And it's important to how that connects to Sun and Rahu in 10th, which already is a public authority weight. Right? There's already, because of that nodal axis, a orientation toward public authority. And so Mercury here adds to that. Communication with Mercury is a likely downstream expression, but it's not the primary structural definition. People will associate communication with Mercury, but that's not structural. The primary statement is that cognition is operating in relation to systems, groups, collective patterns, and distributed fields of association. That could be social, or it might not be. It depends on a lot of other factors. So what happens when a person processes reality through collective fields? When their cognition, their orientation toward information is processed through networks, through groups of people. It may become strategic in relationship to networks of people. Could be someone who's highly aware of group patterns. Could be someone effective at shaping or navigating collective attention. Okay, and again, remember the 10th house thing, because those work together. And so far, not just the 10th house thing, but remember, so far we have a Mercury that is outwardly focused toward networks of people. We have a compensatory pattern where inner instability in house 4 is likely to be compensated without any inner work. If it doesn't happen, it's likely to be compensated via the Sun and Rahu wanting to take public authority in the 10th house. And then remember, from the very beginning, we have a Leo rising who wants to be the center of attention. Well, not necessarily. If we want to be rigorous, centralizes in their interface with reality. not necessarily wanting to be the center of attention, although that is a possible outcome, with Mars adding mobilization of force to that centralization. So when you add those three things up, this is someone who is, you would say, very likely to at least have an itch for celebrity, public power, influence. So now, let's continue on. Saturn and Venus are conjunct in the 12th house. And you notice I'm not even bothering to, except for the first and fourth house, I'm not even going into the level of the signs, which would be a modification. The planet is the function, the house is the domain, and then the sign of the house is a modifier of that. But that complicates, it adds layers to it. We don't even have to do that in this particular chart. It isn't necessary. It would just add more sort of upholstery to it. Okay, so Saturn and Venus in the 12th house. Saturn is structuring, limiting, and imposing authority and constraint. It's not bad. It just puts limits in. Limits can be positive or negative feeling, but limits are a part of life. Venus is valuing and attracting. The 12th house is the domain of dissolution and disengagement. It's where structures thin out, boundaries dissolve, and direct participation in ordinary worldly continuity weakens. So when you have Saturn in the 12th house, it's attempting to structure what is dissolving. So this is a great example of one kind of useful metaphor is when you think about the planet, which is the function, and the house, which is the realm, is to think about the planet as the teacher and the realm is the classroom. So the house can either be a classroom that goes with the agenda of the teacher, or it can go very much against the agenda of the teacher, with lots of variations in between. And it's not a good or a bad thing. It just produces different developmental tensions. So Saturn wants to create order, wants to limit, it wants to create structure. It imposes constraint, and working inside of limits and boundaries is a part of healthy development. When you put Saturn in the 12th house is not about limits and structures. It's about the dissolution of that. So we don't want to call it a weak Saturn. That's too vague and it implies moralization. But it is a challenged Saturn. So the Saturn in the 12th, it's attempting to structure what is dissolving or to impose constraint in a domain where stable structure is difficult to hold. Now, how does that sound familiar? That sounds kind of like the 4th house where Ketu and Moon were in, the inner instability, right? So that adds to that dynamic. Poor or challenged, we would say, challenged stability in the 4th house, inner stability. And the Saturn placement is sort of a general orientation toward boundaries and limits and issues of authority, which is related to structure. That's in a challenged place as well. The Saturn placement will tell you a lot about the person's relationship to boundaries. It's not the only thing, but it's an important thing to look at. Now let's talk about Venus. So Venus is in the 12th as well. That places attraction and valuation, Venus, attraction and valuation, in a field of dissolution, 12th house, rather than in one of direct stabilization or mutuality. So Venus is looking for valuation and attraction. It's wanting to create a stable valuation. It's wanting to create stability downstream of that in relationship. But in the 12th house is like, it's like the Zen house in a way. It's constantly in a state of dissolving. What must go? What must be lost? What cannot hold? And that can be positive in some cases, or it can be, if it's like if you're trying to let go of a relationship that is over, then that 12th house dynamic is a good thing, right? It can be supportive. But if in other cases, it can be quite challenging. So downstream, what does the Venus in 12th show up as? It can show up as relational distance. 12th house is also can translate into withdrawal. So Venus in 12 can turn into privatized pleasure, even secrecy around pleasure, around values. Difficulty with straightforward attachment would be an interpretation of Venus in 12. But structurally, the point is that both value and structure, Venus, are operating, value, Venus, and structure, Saturn, are operating in a domain that resists stable worldly retention. That's the 12th house. What is valued may not be easily held. That's Venus. What is constrained may not become truly secure. That's Saturn. And we already know there's an inner security issue from the 4th house. So what happens when value and structure are displaced in a dissolving domain? Does the person privatize desire? Do they compensate by strengthening outer authority instead? Do they just never do vulnerability? Do they privatize vulnerability? Do they build public centrality because the more private dimensions of valuation and structure do not hold? What kind of person does this produce? You're starting to get the sense we can't definitively say what kind of person it would produce, but you can start to imagine what kind of person it would not produce. This is not someone who is very relational, proactively vulnerable. This is a private person at the very least. What they do around that privacy, we don't know. That's part of the discipline of being clear about what can we know at the structural level and what can we not know. But they're going to have some issues with boundaries and valuation. And also, while we're on the subject, that Venus valuation challenge in 12 is mirrored by the Jupiter placement in 2, because this Venus is a planet that concerns value, and Jupiter is concerns meaning, but it's in the 2nd house, which is the house that concerns continuity, sustenance. There's value in that as well. So that's an expansive element that is sort of opposite the dissolution element in 12. So there's a desire to expand value in the 2nd house. Jupiter in 2 sometimes can turn people into chasing money, for example. But at the same time, you've got Venus in 12, which is dissolving it as fast as it's being built in 2, in the 2nd house, you see. So it's an interesting polarity, and that's one of the things you want to look for in a chart are what are the developmental tensions, because they produce, they're more informative than just what does this one thing say. You want to look at the polarities. Okay, so we're nearly done. And as usual, this is taking longer than I thought. That's okay. I hope you're still with me. So let's talk about discharge pathways. What happens with triggers? What happens with compensation? Well, this chart's base is unstable, right? 4th house, unstable. Regulation is always pressure-based. That's the moon in 4th house in Scorpio. So it seeks pressure to stabilize, but the stability is challenged by that K2. So 4th house does not produce clean grounding, so pressure is just going to build in this person. Unless, there's always an asterisk, unless they get help, unless they make good choices, whatever. But this is the challenge, is there's serious instability here. So when a system cannot stabilize at that base level in 4, that energy, you could say, or that emotion or whatever it is, that essence, it has to discharge somewhere. What are they going to do? So then the question is, what are the available functions? So if they're weak, quote unquote, in 4, challenged, better said, in 4th house, what are the available functions to compensate? Where are they placed? And what can they efficiently do with that? It's basically, it's like when I studied jiu-jitsu, one of the first principles was if your attacker has a weapon, most likely he's already got it in his hand. People generally lead with the best thing they got. And so it is with compensation patterns. Smart people use their minds to compensate. Dominant people use psychological leverage to compensate. People who are good at withdrawing use the silent treatment. We use whatever we have to compensate. So, what are the predictable structural compensation patterns of this chart? Well, Mars in the first is the immediate one that you'd first look at, because that's an existential force orientation toward life. It can act quickly and directly at the very interface with reality. Sun with Rahu in the 10th gives the person enormous leverage in public. Identity, Sun, and hunger, Rahu, are concentrated in the domain of authority and visibility. So that's a likely place where it's going to go. Jupiter in the second house can enlarge continuity narratives. Remember, second house is continuity and sustenance. So it will bring meaning to continuity, which creates narratives and justify the expansion. Mercury in 11th can process and differentiate in the collective field. Mercury in 11th house is what people would typically call a strong placement, because the mercurialness of Mercury, information processing, communication, it's happy in that classroom, so to speak, because it can process and differentiate with groups of people, and especially with all this other authority stuff. The 11th house of networks is the person is going to connect with lots of people, process information with people. Networks will be active in a cognition way, and the person's likely to hold a position of authority because of the first house Mars and the 10th house Sun and Rahu. Not definitively, but likely. And then Saturn and Venus in the 12th are less likely to provide immediate discharge because they're operating in a dissolving domain. So those are not quote unquote strong placements for Saturn and Venus. They're not the best foot for the defense system of this person to put forward. And like I said, when it comes to compensation, our defenses use the best weapons that they have. So the weapons not available to this person are Saturn, structure, and Venus's attraction, relating, valuing. Those kinds of things are not going to be. The efficient discharge path is not going to be inward soothing because the fourth house is compromised, or stable internal grounding. It's public assertion. It's the Mars and 10th house stuff. Okay. So I'm just looking at my outline here, make sure I got to everything. I think that's pretty much it. So now let's talk about the Mahadasha. So this person began Jupiter major period in late 2016. Now that matters because the active planetary function becomes Jupiter. When you go into the major period of the planet, you look at where that planet is placed and what does it want to do. Well, as said, Jupiter is the function of expansion toward integration and meaning, and it's placed in the second house of continuity and sustenance. So the current major period amplifies the chart's continuity structures, self-valuation structures, and the meaning making that supports them. So Jupiter is not floating abstractly, but it's operating inside this chart. Its activation does not create abstract wisdom or generalized benevolence. It's not unilaterally good, like I said. It amplifies whatever continuity structure the chart is already built around. What is the continuity structure that the chart is built around? Leo rising, Mars driven at the interface of reality in first, and a 10th house Rahu Sun hunger for public authority with a weaker internal base. So Jupiter is going to expand that, depending on how much the person has potentially maybe deconstructed those drives, but Jupiter is going to expand that compensation pattern to the degree that compensation pattern still exists. Jupiter also expands the continuity narrative of the self. It enlarges what must persist, what must be justified, what must be sustained, or at least whatever the individual thinks must be justified, enlarged, and sustained. Speech can become an expression of that. That's a second house thing. But the structural issue is deeper. Jupiter gives philosophical and meaning-based enlargement to the very structures the chart already uses to preserve centrality. Let me say that again. Jupiter gives philosophical and meaning-based enlargement to the very structures the chart already uses to preserve centrality. So what happens then? The broadening of influence is a possibility. The inflation of self-justifying narratives is a possibility. Amplification of a worldview that preserves continuity of self in increasingly extreme ways is a possibility. So you can imagine different possibilities, different expression possibilities of this structure form. A person with this chart could become a visible leader whose force, confidence, and centrality are harnessed into disciplined authority. Or they could become a performer whose inner instability is regulated through attention and visibility. Or they could become a polarizing public figure who uses force, narrative enlargement, and visible dominance to compensate for their internal fractured world. Or they could become a charismatic organizer who depends on external consequence to feel real. So the point is not that the chart predicts a single life or predicts a set of personality descriptions. When you go to that, then you start asserting things that are they're too falsifiable. That's what I love about this way of reading the structural chart. What I'm asserting here is that the sort of we're reading the potentiality, the structure of that limits the field of possibilities that the person could become. That is inarguable. What is arguable about it is what the downstream possibilities are. So, whose chart is it? The answer is Donald Trump. Dun dun! Donald Trump's chart. Often looked at these days, and by the way, he went into Jupiter major period in November of 2016. That was the month he won the first election. Uncanny timing. Uncanny timing. It's really quite a remarkable chart. And when you look at that Moon and Ketu in fourth house Scorpio, if you understand this, you should feel compassion, because that is a seriously unstable, potentially, and likely, it's a seriously unstable inner world. And then you add on to that 12th house Venus and Saturn. This is someone with a unstable inner world and a compromised ability to stabilize evaluation and relationship issues because of that 12th house placement with Saturn. And Saturn itself in 12th severely can limit the ability for someone to set boundaries for themselves, for others. So this is someone who is he's seeking to regulate his own internal dysregulation through intensity. Somewhere in there, he actually wants boundaries, like all Enneagram 8s secretly do. He wants boundaries, but he's not capable of arriving at the inner stability that he wants. At least, not capable. It's severely challenged. He would have to do a lot of work on himself to be able to rein in that Sun, Rahu, 10th house Yang energy plus the Mars and first house Yang energy. It's so tempting a compensation, right? As long as that is working for him, and by many measures it is, right? He's a billionaire. He's still loved by 35% of the country or whatever, so that his compensation has been rewarded. Why would he deal with the internal instability? especially now that Jupiter is basically saying, yeah, go for it. Be president of the United States, be the most powerful person in the world. It's saying take your compensation pattern to the logical extreme. Where will that go? Well, I personally think he's going to die inside Jupiter major period, which is, I think, if I remember right, 17 years. So that's still like 10 more years. No, 7 more years, 6 or 7 more years. I don't think he's going to survive through the end of 2026. He doesn't look like he's doing very well. And I think part of the logic of that is that Jupiter is helping him to dead end. That's what it does. It scales whatever you got going. And if what you got going is structurally sound, then you grow healthily. If it's not, then it blows up in your face. And starting a war with Iran, with what appears to be not a very good plan and a lot of confusing communication about that, that sure looks like Jupiter inflating the compensational patterns of his chart, doesn't it? It certainly works. So that's my demonstration. And like I said, a bit longer than I thought, but I wanted this to be a foundational example so that when I do ones in the future, they won't be as long. At least I don't think so. I would love to know what you think. If you are still new to Vedic astrology, this may be a bit complex, but I repeated myself a lot. Hopefully that helps. And it is like learning another language, and like all language learning, so much of it is just repetition. I think it's so worth learning, especially if you're interested in your own self-development, and if you're interested in helping other people develop. Well, you by now hopefully know what I think about that. I think it's not negotiable. It's far more powerful than the Enneagram. It's, like I said, it's the mechanics of how and why the Enneagram is. So let me speak to that for just a moment before we close here. So can you see how the Enneagram 8 dynamics, how do I say this? If you look at the Enneagram has some parental orientation stuff. There's not a lot written about it, and I did some contributions in that domain, parental orientations, childhood conditioning, that kind of stuff. But the Enneagram doesn't say what the structure of the psyche is. They do a little, not like astrology does, right? So astrology says this person has Mars in first. Trump has Mars in first house in Leo. He structurally, at an existential level, has a centralizing orientation toward life. It's about him. And then Mars wants to direct force out at life. Well, that's why he's an 8. It's not all of why he's an 8. That's one piece of it. How and why else is he an 8? Because he's so unstable because of his 4th house, Moon and Ketu in Scorpio, and so gifted, quote unquote, enabled, empowered. He's empowered opposite that in the 10th house, that it's just a sine qua non. It goes without saying that his defense system is going to use that public authority in 10th house and that communication and cognition in networks of people in 11th house as a way to compensate his inner instability. That's the map for how and why he's an Enneagram 8. The Enneagram 8 is largely a descriptive, attribute-based, content-based description of the result. It doesn't capture the structure. And if you want to help someone, you need to know the architecture of the psyche, the structure of how it works, so that when Donald Trump is triggered, for example, he goes to, how can I take up more authority, direct more force? That's the pattern you'd interrupt, right? And you'd help him to self-regulate in a way that is less intense, maybe find some outlet for self-regulation that is maybe not not intense because he's going to be a Scorpio moon no matter what, but maybe more productively intense. Like maybe instead of starting international crises to make yourself feel stable on the inside, you could try rock climbing or something. I don't know. Pick up learning how to ride a unicycle. That's intense. You know, alternative forms of regulation. Now, this may sound like, cognitive behavioral therapy, but this is what some people need. It depends on the person. But, on a very simple level, I was actually just a week or two ago, I was watching a documentary about Columbine, the first, I believe that was the first serious school shooting in the United States that started many, unfortunately. And I was watching this documentary and I was like, I wonder if somebody did the chart for, it was these two guys, I forget their names. And sure enough, someone had the birth time and someone did the chart. And one of the guys had a Scorpio moon in the 8th house. I believe it was also the Jayastha nakshatra. And even more extremely unstable than a moon in the 4th house. The 8th house in my system is the house of... it's the house of the loss of control. It's the house of irreversible transformation through the loss of control. So stability for a person of that configuration is they're looking to internally regulate, internally stabilize by seeking intensity, being changed by life, and losing control. Well, there you go. That's the kind of person who's going to be more likely to shoot up a school and commit suicide by cop. Actually, those two guys killed themselves on their own before the cops got there. But there it was. Now, it doesn't have to be that. Such a person with a moon like that could become a artist, like Jackson Pollock comes to mind, someone who pushes the boundaries of the rules, or, a really unusual kind of method actor, like, what's his name? Daniel Day-Lewis, someone who really thrives on intensity and pushing limits in that way. But it's going to be an intense person. And if the intensity of that person is not recognized and someone doesn't help them with the paradox of that the person finds paradoxically stability in instability, well, that spirals out of control very quickly. And meanwhile, everybody's like, whoa, I don't know what's going on with this person. But they're trying to sort out the developmental tension of finding stability amidst instability. That's the challenge. And that's a serious challenge. So I think it's really cool in summary. I hope you think it's cool too. If you don't, I'd love to hear from you. If you do, I'd love to hear from you either way. All of this is an experiment. I think it's interesting, but I don't want to assume that. So if you want more of this kind of stuff, let me know. If you think it's heady and weird and I'm just talking to myself, I'd want to know that too, really. So you know how to reach me. Thanks for listening. I hope you're doing well, whatever you're up to. Bye for now.